this morning's talk is on the idea of new native. Now, it's going to take us a while to get to what I mean about that, but I've been on my own personal journey as a human struggling to fit in, find home in myself and the world forever, and probably on the journey of what some people would call an awakening journey or an awakened journey, probably since my late teens. But I'd never found an integrating truth for everything that was given to me to share. So some of you might know I've done a lot of work in law and activism, on the subject of gender. I do rites of passage. I do a lot of work on sound and new ways of understanding how we use sound. But I didn't have something that integrated all of that until the last couple of years. And that's what I really want to share with you today. But I want to ask a few questions just to help inform me of where all of you are kind of coming from. So if you feel like answering, I'd really appreciate your thoughts on this. So when you come along to events like this, what is it you are looking for? What do you want?
New insights.
New insights. Yeah, okay. What else? Yes.
Knowledge.
Knowledge, okay.
Inspiration.
Inspiration.
Connection.
Connection's a good one.
Fresh perspective.
Strategies. Perspectives.
Fresh perspective.
All right, great. And would you all agree to some extent that we're in some kind of, have you all used the language of awakening or awakened at some point?
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? Awakening to what? Or awakening from what?
Who we really are. Two. There are two.
One at a time.
Spirituality.
Who we really are? Yeah, that's right.
Spirituality and what's going on in the world.
Okay, so sort of like two separate things.
Personal freedom.
Personal freedom.
Slavery.
Okay, yeah, that ties in with what he was saying, yes?
You know, I find a difficulty with the word awakening.
Yeah, me too.
I use the word realisation.
Okay, yes. Which is to come to what is real. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
chairs roll, people here. Young people, please sit at the front. Oh, right, that was ages.
Okay, it was. Well,
Flexible legs, sit at the front.
we'll let this new rabble get seated before we continue here.
I'm just bringing some more chairs. Sorry to really interrupt.
That's all right. I can pause for a moment while people get settled.
Youngsters at the front, yeah, if you don't mind. If you catch very
Who feels like identifying as a youngster today? We're going to have a whole bunch of silver heads down here on their knees going, yeah! Okay. Does everyone who wants a seat have one? Would anyone like this seat? Anyone need a seat that doesn't have one? Okay. Because they're amplified back there, can everyone at the back hear me okay? Do I need to speak up? Because we're not amplified here. Can everyone hear okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks for your thoughts there, everyone, on what you thought was going on, because one of the things that I feel is a failure of the so-called New Age, of the awakening, of the realization, of whatever you want to call it, is a failure to agree terms. A failure to agree terms. So what we have is a whole bunch of people who actually have a lot in common, but because they don't have shared terms, we are fragmented. So you've got off-gridders, you've got the alternative medicine law, you've got the alternative gardening law, you've got the alternative movement law, you've got the healing law, you've got the sort of spiritual love and lighters, and yet they're all fragmented because of their inability to agree terms. And today what I want to share with you is the integrating terms that I've found. Now, my favourite psychiatrist, if there is such a thing, is a guy called M. Scott Peck, and he's an amazing American thinker. He's done some great books on love, on evil, and on community. And in his books on working with people in the subject of their emotional mental health, he says that a large part of his job is to help people to come to terms with how they feel, where the term is the name. And I think we still have to come to terms with what the awakening and the realization actually is. And the spiritual notions that a lot of people have been playing with, myself included for many decades, are wonderful in reconnecting, but they tend to lack groundedness. They tend to isolate from social issues. You know, some of you might find that you've done that yourself. I certainly have. And so it's not an integrating factor, if you know what I mean. But it's definitely a factor that we need to reconnect with, we need to become skilled at, have some insight with. And the same applies with all the other so-called alternative things. Now, what I have kind of, let me just see here. Okay. So what I realised in my journey of looking for terms, and also a lot of the work, some of you might have seen some of my other work, you'll know that all of it's based on spelling, where we spell all our words, because all our words are spells. And I mean, what do I mean by a spell? Well, I mean a word or phrase of magical effect. And everybody here thinks less of themselves than they should, or maybe treats themselves less than they should, as a result of something somebody said to you once, maybe decades ago. And that's what I mean by a spell. You know, where you can be hobbled for decades, think less of yourself, contract, all the rest of it, just with some words somebody threw at you. So the spells that we're given can either guide, uplift, enlighten, or they can mislead, contain, detain, contract, all that sort of stuff. Now, one thing really got me over the years, and it was just a quirky thing, and it was probably about 10 years I've been scratching my head on it, and it was, why do Western, educated, and white people refer to indigenous or native people without referring to themselves? Because if you're not indigenous, then what are you? If you're not native, what are you? What are we actually saying here? Now, this was a head scratcher for many years because there's some seemingly obvious answers in there, for those of you that are into off-world interventions and all that sort of stuff. But actually the answer I came to is much simpler than that. And it was actually, I was spending some time with some Mexican natives a couple of years ago, and it wasn't actually the time with the natives that gave me the answer. It was my English friend, a lady I've known for many years, who actually gave me the answer. And it changed everything for me. Because her answer was, because Europe was colonized so long ago that we've forgotten. And that the colonization was so effective in Europe that the bridges to our stories, our ancestral connection, our connection with each other, and the earth was effectively annihilated. And it is simply an act of forgetting, not the fact that you're not native. And what I've realized is that the whole of the... So, how many of you here have been called alternative or have called yourself alternative at some point? Now that's a really interesting spell, because as soon as you call something alternative, you have made it the smaller second choice. You've made it the smaller second choice. It's the alternative. It's the other smaller thing. How many of you feel like you're representing the other smaller thing? Okay? Because I don't feel like you are. I feel like you are representing the central main thing. You're not the alternative. You are our hope. You are the beacons of the future. You are the ones going through the healing journey. And what I discovered was that all the things that we call alternative, I named some of them earlier, alternative medicine, alternative gardening, alternative ways of living, alternative movement, that actually all of these things are not alternative at all. And that they are in fact a natural healing process. They are in fact a natural decolonisation of the European bloodlines. A natural decolonisation of the European bloodlines. Where, how many of you never felt like you fit in? Your whole life. So I would say you're from the bloodlines where colonisation was not complete. Either that or your spirit was aware that the way you were invited to live was not one that would lead you to health, happiness and well-being. And so you couldn't fit in to what was not natural to you and what was not native to you. And so when we look at alternative medicine, it's just simply a return to more native medicine, integrating plants and food. If we look at alternative gardening, it's simply a return to native gardening, which is to understand the relationships between the plants. Alternative movement is trying to rediscover our natural dance, our natural way of interacting and responding with the world. And the same with our native sounding and things like that. And the problem, I mean, that's the way, actually I teach sound as us reclaiming our native sounding. Whereas if you go and learn from others about how to sound, they'll teach you Indian chanting. They'll teach you Mongolian throat singing. And you will get an overlay of somebody else's way of doing it. Now, I think that's okay because I've used the traditions and cultures, traditions and practices of other cultures as well. And what I've discovered through it all is that, and this is from meeting natives as well, they're really happy to share their processes with us and their methods and the things that we've forgotten. They don't want us to walk away wearing their clothes and calling us their names. That's what we call appropriation. But what I've found is useful from that is they are giving us the bridge for us to rediscover our own, a new nativeness. Rediscovering what it is to be connected from having experienced disconnection and disembodiment. And what I discovered when I met with native elders is that they are experiencing the same problems that we are with their children. They're losing them to screens, they're losing them to ideas which don't fit with human well-being long term. And they feel isolated. They've done a lot of work on their rights, but they feel isolated. There's no doubt about that. But one thing they have definitely got is they have got a bridge to the past that we do not have. So we have something that they do not have, and that is a bridge to the future. They have no clear vision of the future, how to get out of this. And through our time of disconnection and disembodiment, we've got those gifts. And this is a coming together of the old natives and the new natives to actually make a stand against that which is not native. Now, what do I mean by that? So, how many of you have been involved in law stuff or interested in law stuff? There's plenty of law stuff going on here this weekend. All right, I spent about 15 years in that law world, attending cases, backing cases, getting involved in them, watching people adopting all sorts of different law forms to get into legal arguments and legal debates. And I've had enough of it. And I've seen that what happens is, it's us that have to lose our days travelling to court. It's us that have to pay for that. And I've watched the establishment just wear my colleagues and peers down. And there's people that I know who have risen to fame, success, legal effectiveness, and died in the time since I've been in this movement. And they've never lived to see the world that they were fighting for. And that is, I mean, history is littered with that. History is littered with activists and people that thought they were close to making it. And we haven't yet. So there is a kind of a problem in there where when we have nowhere to go, when there is no place of respite, which is a question of jurisdiction for those of you who are into the law stuff, then it means that the only battle you have is the one for supremacy. So whenever you go to the courtroom, whenever you're going to compete your ideas, you're always seeking to win the whole ground because there's nothing else. How many of you have been at this for many years and are actually quite tired, been out for decades? Yeah. Because when you go home, it's not gone away. There's other pressures. We have nowhere to go. So the work that I'm working on now is seeking to establish something that we don't have in the West. And that is a native reservation. Because this is about the shift. So what you're actually looking for is to be left alone, to live the way you want to live, based on how you are moved and inspired from within and around you. And that is a hallmark of all natives. They are all moved by unseen forces within and around them that they recognize and value as much as the physical world. How many of you would agree with that? Okay. So that's a hallmark of all natives. So, under human rights, that is called self-determination and security and liberty of the person. Lots of people have been fighting for that for decades. I don't know anybody that's got it. However, if you take the fight from under human rights to under indigenous rights, you have a totally different ballgame. Because indigenous rights have realised self-determination and security and liberty of the person within the areas of indigenous jurisdiction. That exists in America, it exists in Australia, it doesn't exist anywhere in Europe. Nobody has stood for it. And this, sorry?
How about the gypsies?
The gypsies are a remnant of before. And they're an example, you're right, they are an example of a people that still have their own rights. Yes, and that's a great example, thank you. So they're probably one of the only recognised indigenous peoples that still enjoy those freedoms across the body of Europe. So I'm building a campaign over the next couple of years using particular legal instruments to seek for reservations in the West. The reason I've been bringing this, I've taken this message to South America, North America, Europe, to doctors, lawyers, all the rest of it. Everybody gets it. Everybody gets the fact that what we were calling alternative might actually just be a shift back to a more native way of being. Now, what's interesting about that is, when you're off on the spiritual ascension journey, or, I don't know, I'm going to be a free man and win the law thing, or whatever they are castles in the sky. And I've lived them. I've lived decades of my life in them. And they're good. They're enjoyable. But that's not where the front line is. It's not where the front line is. And the problem that we are all dealing with, I think, is that you're all sensitives. And this world is not kind to sensitive people. But this is why I actually got out of the law game, was because I realised I couldn't take care of myself. And I had to go away and learn how to cultivate my own resilience to come back ready for another round, which is where I'm at after about a 10-year break. But it took that long to recover. But it's a really interesting notion, because in our language, the term native reservation has two meanings. It's a place where natives live, but it's also to have a quiet concern. To have a native reservation. Have a quiet concern about that. And so really, whether or not you identify as native or not, one of the things I invite you to consider is that this campaign that I'm working on is for anyone who has a native reservation about what's going on in the world, to try to find a place where the debate stops, because the jurisdiction changes. So you don't have to justify yourself, you don't have to explain yourself, you don't have to seek to be understood. The native banner champions your right to do it your way without prescribing how you do it. And that's what makes it different from any other solution that we've looked at so far. The other thing about it is that if you look at the work that's been done in the woke agenda on Indigenous rights, there's a lot of power to ride there. Because one of the things, again, I've been at this for many years, and I've seen people take court cases, big ones, that the judges have been on side, and you can see it, but it doesn't go their way. Why not? Why does it not go their way?
Sorry, the judges are paid.
It challenges their system.
No. That judge is a human being like you. And he's looking at this and they're right. But am I going to be the guy? Am I the one?
Yeah.
And then on Friday, am I going to get disbarred and overruled anyway? So the thing that the truth movement didn't achieve is what the mafia did. And that is, you've got to look after the judge. If you don't look after the judge, if you don't make him a social hero, but these days it's not money. It's not money. It is the court of social opinion everywhere. If you can't make the judge a hero, don't bother taking the case. You're just mavericking. You're just showboating for your own ego. Guaranteed. And every case that I've seen that's been taken has been exactly that. And people have burnt the limited resources that we've got. They've burnt the limited time that they've got without actually understanding what we're dealing with here. And the thing about the native story and the riding the back of the woke agenda is before any case gets taken, you need virality. If you don't have virality, then you're just going to disappear. And I've seen it happen, There's loads of people there's the community assemblies, there's the common law courts, there's all this sort of stuff. I've seen stuff shinier with more money and more international money behind it come and go and disappear because it wasn't approached in the sort of right way. Now I'll tell you what is an interesting question that is viral. The question of white natives. That's viral. That is a very viral question. That is a hot potato of the European white natives, the so-called alternatives that didn't fit in. They have nowhere to go and nowhere to be. It's simply a conversation and a question. So that's the push that will be going. But I want to go back to the subject of what it means to you because I want to raise an interesting word with you all that's very, very charged and controversial. But before I do, I want to share a bit of spelling with you. So in our language, we have prefixes and suffixes that are universal in meaning. So re, before a word, you all know what that means, don't you?
Yeah.
To do it again. Okay, so I want to look at the suffix ity. Ity, okay? So severity is a measure of how severe something is, isn't it? Yeah, everyone agree? The severity of something is a measure of how severe it is. Anyone disagree? Okay. Serenity is a measure of how serene you are. Yes? Okay. Divinity, a measure of divine. Agreed? So we see a universality in that suffix. All right, charged word time. The charged word is nativity. Nativity is a measure of how native you are. That's all it is. And the thing about nativeness is that it is about your divine, that you are all here by divine birthright. You're all here, none of you are here by accident. All of you are here by divine mandate, if indeed you agree in the notions of the fact that there might be a spirit that created things, or that there is some kind of plan, or some kind of order. Any of those things would say that you're not here by accident. Anyone think you're here by accident? Anyone think that you are redundant, that you were pointless, that you have no purpose or meaning or function? No? I'm glad. That's great. It's a wonderful place to be. So you're all here for something. So you're all here as part of the great machine of life, part of the great organ of doing and being. And the anchoring that nativeness brings integrates your ideas of spirit, integrates your relationship with the land, integrates your relationship with each other. It is a quiet solution where all fight dissolves, because there's no competition for supremacy anymore. It's just a quiet quest for somewhere to stand. And if you imagine in any sort of TV stuff or films that you've seen, if you've seen Native Americans or Maoris or anything, and they're going into courtrooms, how do they turn up? Are they pompous and arrogant, or do they just quietly sit? I've never seen one not just quietly sit. Because they're not there to fight, they're not there to compete for supremacy, they're just there for the right to stand. And I actually had a genuine breakdown over this, because I've been fighting for decades. I've been caught up in the franticness and the desperation of my fight for 20 years. And it all fell out of me. Didn't know what to do. It was like jelly when I was trying to motivate myself. But I'll tell you why it happened. And it was because, and this is where we start to get to the crux of this, which is, how did we get to this situation where we didn't identify as being native? And it is because of this thing that we call colonisation. So I want to look at that word for a bit, because what do we actually mean by that? So when I first gave this talk, it was a bunch of international doctors, and I used the example with them of where we're normally, when we're talking about a colony or being colonised, we're talking about the gut, and we're talking about bacterial colony. So let's look at that for a second. So imagine I've got a bacterial colony in a petri dish. What's the other word for that? It's a culture. It's a culture. Okay, so let's look at what is a culture. What is it that denotes people being of the same culture? It is values. Values. It is direction. It is a shared sense of what a person does to be a good and contributory human being. There's a whole list of values that denote culture. And what I realised was, I, in my competition for supremacy, was fawning, desperate, cap in hand, going to be understood, seeking to have my values understood and respected. Because I didn't realise at the time, but you knew it, that these people don't respect your values. They don't share them. So they would be going, oh, please see this unseen thing and the value of it, and oh, how it's moving me, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be dealing with these people who are scorning down their nose at me as if they had some kind of higher truth. And through this epiphany, I had a realization, which was, wait a minute, why am I defending and justifying myself to you? Because if I look at the humans who live the way you champion, they hate themselves, they're addicted, depressed, overweight, suicidal, and waiting for their lives to be over. Why am I defending myself to you? You're clearly an idiot. If you are championing a way of life that leads to misery and suffering for the majority, why am I contracting in response to your sneer and scorn? And in a way, what I've realised, so in the ancestral work that I do, and ancestral connection, I do a lot about how all of our structures are ancestral gifts. Because most of you don't know how to refine metal, you don't know how to build structures, but the ancestral gift of the knowledge and ability to do those has been handed down to us, so you don't need to. You don't need to worry about the rain on you or being cold or having to walk 20 miles for water, because our ancestors encoded that so well that you don't need to. So in a way, when you are at home, when you are in the office and in your car, you're not actually in the real world. You're in Granny and Granddad's cave. You're wrapped in the coat of the ancestors, keeping the world at bay. And what I've realized is I've been dealing with people who've been living in Granny and Granddad's cave their whole life, while we natives have been outside with the wind blowing in our hair, going, wow, this feels great, while they're inside going, there is no wind. And there was me, please understand, please see the wind, please. The only time you need to do that is when you're competing for supremacy. And when you don't need to convert, when you don't need to win over, then you've secured the right to be. Which is actually what most of us really want.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, how are we doing on time? Oh, that's great. So, yeah. I can keep going. It's just about... I didn't want to make this just a sort of a presentation. I want to try and make it a bit interactive. So, we can move on to a bit of questions in a bit. But, let me just see what other points I had down here. I've not flipped through this book, so now I'm getting all her art. Until I find my notes. Wait a second. Some monster thing. Some teddy bears. Great. There we go. There's my teddy bear that was right next there. Okay. Yeah, so I just want to say something about the colony again. So, if we look at what's happened with colonisation, what you've got is... So, have any of you heard me talk about the totic parasite? Anyone? No? Anyone come across the notion of wetico?
Yes.
Okay. The totics, we talk about this as well, which is the notion of some kind of parasitic infestation in our species. One which is not necessarily a physical worm, but one which can still influence our mind and feelings. Now, in a way, every one of you is affected emotionally and mentally by microscopic things. Viruses, bacteria, and also, and the most common one, I would say, is probably sugar bacteria. So sugar bacteria in your stomach give you cravings, making you believe that you want sugar. But it's not you that wants sugar. It's the bacteria that wants it. And because of the way that we are all symbiotes, we experience its hunger as if it was our own. But it's not. And this is how all parasites behave. They all behave in the same way. They trick the host into believing that it is the host, so that the host will then serve its needs. So a good example of that is mistletoe. So mistletoe is a parasitic plant. What it does is it lodges on a tree and tricks the tree into believing that it is a branch. So the tree will give it nurture. All parasites behave in the same way. And the notion of wetico, the notion of the totic parasite, is that has happened to us on a more mental level. And if we look at the ways of the colony, if we look at what it does, it behaves in exactly the same way as a parasite, and that is, it takes the resources of the native host and converts it to meet the desires of the colony, which will tend to leave the host in a reduced state of well-being. But the thing about parasites is they don't want to kill the host. They just want it in a low state of health so that it can reap the rewards of having its hungers and needs met. How many of you have heard about some of the hungers being fed in the world and the colony and thought, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound very human or decent. And this is where the notion of Wetiko and the parasite comes in, is the fact that actually the colony itself is like a parasitic infestation in our species. And that actually this whole native awakening that I'm speaking of is actually a kind of a planetary scale healing. Because the notion of Wetiko, so anybody here heard of Lyle Watson?
Yes.
Life Tide and Supernature. Okay, so he's an evolutionary biologist who has spent his life studying tektites, meteors, and space dust. And he said he's studied things which come from places thousands of times more organic than Earth. And most of the stuff that has come to the planet, new things like new molecules, new things like that, have come on dust. And this is where the notion of us being starseed actually comes from. It comes from the fact, or the idea, that the planet is seeded new code, new structures that it didn't have before. And Lyell's notion of it is, he was one of the ones that was instrumental in coming up with the Gaia hypothesis. And he was at where the planet is a being. And he was saying that the ice ages were like sleep cycles, and that when the planet emerged from each sleep cycle, it was producing more and more complex life forms out of its own stuff. And he was suggesting this was in response to stuff that comes into the planet. Because unlike us, if we eat something that isn't nice, we will either throw it up or poo it out. And the planet can't do either. It either has to integrate or die. That's it. And he says this is where the notion of comets and meteors as being bad omens came from. Because plague and pestilence would often follow. And he was suggesting that this was the biospheric response to the new material coming in. So weird molecules coming from space, we break out in pustules and weird things like that. I mean, it's really weird. None of us have any real sense of what that's all about, how we break out in pustules and sores and stuff like that, or maybe weird bleeding in response to these things. We don't know. But the point is, he says that, and he's suggesting this is what may have caused the die-out of certain animals, is because some kind of parasitic thing came in, invasive species, and actually dominated that one until it died out, or it managed to integrate the infestation. And that's what I think is happening with you lot. Your code, your genetics, your nurture field, your family history have made it such that you are the ones, the first generations, able to integrate the parasitic infestation of Wetiko. And that we gain huge benefits from the disconnection and the disembodiment that it gave us. Because that's what it does. It makes us disembodied and disconnected from what's really going on inside us. That's terrible for our human body, and it's terrible for the earth, but it's amazing for us to get clear new ideas. Because we're completely disconnected from what was. It frees us up completely to innovate completely anew. And that is what we have done. And this is now the return journey, which isn't to castles in the sky. It's back home, here, body and earth. I mean, how many have heard the notions, I mean, it's a bit of a bubble, but that notion of the meek shall inherit the earth, or that notion of the return to the land, the call to the return to the land, that's simply a call to return to more native being. That's it. And again, this notion wasn't about taking earth to heaven in our theology, was it? It was heaven to earth. It was a notion of bringing spirit here, not to awaken spirit and then run off, which is actually spiritual escapism, and most of us have probably done that. I did it for years, I just want to get away from here. It's just so uncomfortable, it's so unpleasant. Oh, this energy feels amazing, I'll just live here. Oh, I can't. Or I can, but the world doesn't go away and the world doesn't change. Whereas this, to me, this notion of the native story integrates all of this for me. It integrates my legal stand. It integrates my spirituality. It integrates the quest that I've been on sound and movement, to reclaim something that is ours in all these lands and doesn't belong to somebody else. And I just want to give you a gift on that, because we're going to wrap up in a second, but I want to set you all free in your pursuit of alternative practices. So whenever you go along to some kind of chanting session or alternative movement session or anything like that, or even a sweat lodge or something like that, you will probably get given it in a tradition of another culture today. But what I want you all to know is that it is yours. because actually every single one of those things, stretching skin on wood to hit it, making vowel sounds, moving in response to the unseen forces within you, these are all from a common ancestor. Even the hot tent, the lodge, is evidence across Europe and Scotland of us using hot tents and lodges. We just forgot the technology and the method. You going and following a Native American sort of footstep into the use of the hot tent is great and fine. But please realise that is your ancestral tech too. Nobody owns the beating of the drum. Nobody owns the sounding of vowels. You are not appropriating anybody else's practice by doing it. In fact, you're trying to rediscover your own. And so I invite you to try on these other practices, but don't keep them. Don't walk away wearing them. Use them as the stepping stone to reclaiming your own ancestral connections, your own alignment, and your own nativity, your own nativeness. And I have found nothing in all these years of fighting and franticness and desperation. I've had nothing that's given me a sense of quiet home than landing this idea. So I appreciate for some of you it's quite a radical notion. Even the notion of sort of decolonisation is a bit of an Americanized word, but actually I really mean it. You know, I really mean it as a natural healing process. So I'm going to let you digest for a moment and open up to questions and conversation. If everyone's up for that. Anyone got any questions or thoughts? Oh, thank you.